Imagine you live in a city with just about 2,250 residents, where the median household income is $109,870, and yet 17.3% of people still live in poverty. A city where the streets are lined with marble, the suits are expensive, the brunches are strategic, and more than 30% of all jobs are in government. That is not just a capital city. That is a psychological ecosystem. You are walking through Washington, D.C. It is 7:43 a.m. A staffer is speed walking with AirPods in, rehearsing talking points. A lobbyist is already on coffee number 2, smiling like democracy is a group project and he did the slides. A journalist is checking Signal. A policy analyst is opening a 43-page PDF. No normal human should be emotionally prepared to read before sunrise. And somewhere behind a polished door, somebody is deciding which crisis gets framed as urgent, which gets buried in committee, and which gets renamed so it sounds less terrifying on cable news. Because that is the thing about Washington, D.C. The city does not just run on money, it runs on proximity to power, status anxiety, institutional performance, and the strange psychological effect of living in a place where everyone seems to be auditioning for relevance. This is a city where influence often matters more than wealth, where language becomes camouflage, where ambition dresses itself up as public service, and where even casual small talk can feel like a low-stakes Senate hearing. In this video, we're going to break down the psychology of Washington, D.C., not the tourist version with monuments and school trips, the real version. The emotional machinery underneath the city. Why D.C. attracts a certain kind of personality. Why so many people here become obsessed with titles, access, and prestige. Why moral certainty and career incentives often end up in the same elevator. Why a city can be both hyper-educated and deeply insecure. And why a place built to manage national power often produces a population that is brilliant, anxious, performative, over-networked, and just a little bit haunted. We will look at the incentives, the class structure, the language games, the status rituals, the policy culture, the social climbing, the moral theatre, and the quiet loneliness that comes from living in a city where your job is often your identity. Your ideology is sometimes your brand, and your calendar is basically your soul in spreadsheet form. And yes, we will do it with facts, history, economics, and just enough dark humour to survive the ride. Welcome to Washington, D.C., the only city where people will say they are working on democracy, when what they really mean is they are editing bullet points for a deputy assistant something or other's memo at 11:48 p.m. Bonn, the city of proximity power. You cannot understand Washington, D.C. until you understand one basic rule. In this city, power is rarely consumed directly. It is experienced through proximity, not ownership, not always even authority. Proximity. That is the first psychological trick D.C. plays on people. In most cities, status is easier to measure. In Los Angeles, you can often see it. In New York, you can bill it by the hour. In Miami, it may arrive on a yacht and pretend to be humble for exactly 7 seconds. But in Washington, status is usually more abstract. It lives in access. Who gets invited? Who gets looped in? Who is copied on the email? Who is in the room? Who can text someone 3 levels above them and get a response in under 4 minutes? In a city where the federal government still directly accounts for nearly 1 in 4 jobs in the district, about 22.8% of workers in December 2025, and where a huge share of the rest orbit law, consulting, contracting, media, non-profits, and advocacy. It is not surprising that social life starts to feel like a giant map of influence rather than a normal community. Imagine you are 27 years old. You just moved to DC from Boston, Atlanta, Chicago, maybe Austin. You're smart, over-caffeinated, and just idealistic enough to still say things like, "I want to make a difference," without immediately cringing. Your first week in the city, somebody asks not who you are, but what do you do? Then, 2 minutes later, which office? Then, if they are feeling especially subtle, how close are you to the principal? Welcome to Washington, where ordinary conversation often feels like LinkedIn in a human costume. And to be fair, there is a strong case for this culture. DC is the seat of the federal government, the home of embassies, think tanks, national media bureaus, trade groups, unions, courts, defense institutions, and advocacy networks, high-stakes decisions really are being made here. If you care about legislation, regulation, budgets, war, diplomacy, antitrust, immigration, healthcare, labour law, or climate policy, being close to the process genuinely matters. Networks are not always fake. Sometimes they are functional. Sometimes knowing the right person is the difference between getting a veterans program funded and watching it die in a subcommittee with a beautiful mission statement and no appropriations. So yes, relationships matter here for legitimate reasons. That part is real. But then the psychology mutates, because once a city teaches people that access is valuable, people start performing access even when they do not have it. They begin speaking in borrowed authority. They learn the accent of importance. They say things like, "We're hearing the administration may be moving on this," when what they actually mean is, "A friend of my boss had drinks with someone who once interned near this issue." DC is a city where rumour often wears a lanyard and calls itself analysis. That performance culture thrives because DC is exceptionally educated and professionally credentialed. More than 3/4 of adults 25 and older in the district have a bachelor's degree or higher, according to census data. The median household income is about $109,870, and per capita income is roughly $77,348. On paper, this is one of the most accomplished urban populations in America. But here is the uncomfortable part. High achievement environments often produce status anxiety, not confidence. When everybody's impressive, impressiveness loses market value. The baseline becomes absurd. You're no longer doing well. You're just another person at a rooftop happy hour with 2 graduate degrees, a policy memo, and unresolved childhood perfectionism. And that helps explain one of DC's deepest psychological contradictions. It is a city that looks self-important because it is full of insecure overachievers. That is not even an insult. It is almost a system's description. Think about the incentive structure. In Washington, many people do not produce visible consumer products. They produce influence, interpretation, coordination, permission structures, risk management, legislative language, strategic framing, institutional alignment. In plain English, they produce things that matter a lot but are often intangible. That makes symbolic markers more important. Titles matter because output is harder to see. Seating charts matter because hierarchy is part of the workflow. Invitations matter because exclusivity signals relevance. Even exhaustion becomes a status symbol. "Sorry, I've just been slammed," is not always a complaint here. Sometimes it is a peacock feather, and cities adapt to their dominant labour market. DC has long revolved around the federal state and its extended ecosystem. That ecosystem is powerful, but it is also fragile in very specific ways. The district's 2025 labour market was hit hard by federal downsizing, and the local Office of Revenue Analysis noted that the region's unusually high concentration of federal workers made the shock disproportionately severe. By late 2025, federal jobs in the district were down to 87.7% of their January 2025 levels, and broader regional job losses were heavily tied to federal layoffs. The result was not just economic pain, it was identity pain. In DC, when the federal machine contracts, people do not merely lose income, many lose the institution that gave their lives narrative structure. That matters because DC does not just sell careers. It sells moralized careers. A banker in another city can admit with varying degrees of shame that he is here for money. In Washington, the language is usually more elevated. People are here for impact, service, governance, justice, security, democracy, stakeholder engagement, or my personal favourite, mission alignment, which sounds noble until you realise it can describe anything from civil rights litigation to making PowerPoints about asphalt procurement. The point is not that everyone is fake. Plenty of people in DC are sincere, hard-working, and genuinely committed to public service. Many are underpaid relative to their skills. Many do work that keeps the country functioning. But because the city wraps ambition in moral language, it becomes harder to tell where conviction ends and careerism begins. And when a city makes that boundary blurry enough, people start blurring it, inside themselves. That is when the psychology gets interesting. Because now imagine what daily life feels like. You live in one of the most expensive metro ecosystems in America, in a district where the median gross rent is $1,848 and the median value of owner-occupied housing is $706,000, while 17.3% of residents live in poverty. That means you're surrounded by institutional prestige and visible inequality at the same time. You pass think tank panels on inclusive growth, then walk a few blocks and see the brutal arithmetic of who actually gets included. This creates a kind of moral cognitive whiplash. The city talks constantly about justice while structurally rewarding those closest to elite networks. DC is hardly unique in this, but it may be the most articulate about it, which somehow makes it funnier and darker. And then there is the built environment. DC is monumental on purpose. Wide avenues, neoclassical facades, statues, domes, security perimeters. The architecture does not merely house power, it stages it. Cities teach emotion through design. Las Vegas says desire. Wall Street says velocity. Silicon Valley says disruption in a hoodie. Washington says permanence, legitimacy, ceremony. It whispers, history is happening here, even when what is actually happening is 12 people arguing over comma placement in a draft rulemaking notice. So people internalize the set design. They begin narrating themselves as historical actors, even in tiny roles. That can produce courage, discipline, and service. It can also produce theatricality, ego inflation, and the belief that every meeting is the Yalta conference with worse catering. This is why DC often feels so intense even when nothing visible is happening. The city trains people to believe that everything is consequential. Sometimes they are right. Sometimes they are writing a memo that will never survive legal review. Psychologically, though, the body does not always know the difference. The result is a city full of intelligent people living in a chronic atmosphere of managed urgency. And that is our first big takeaway. Washington, D.C. is not just obsessed with power. It is obsessed with nearness to power. Because in a city built around institutions, proximity becomes identity. Once that happens, ambition becomes social currency, access becomes self-worth, and ordinary human interaction starts getting processed through the logic of hierarchy, which is exactly where we need to go next. Because once a city teaches people to chase proximity, the next question is obvious. What does that do to their souls, their speech, their friendships, and their sense of self? 2. Ambition as a personality type. If New York sometimes asks, "How much do you make?" and Los Angeles asks, "How visible are you?" then Washington, D.C. asks a more intimate question, "How important are you, really?" And the reason that question gets under people's skin is because in D.C., ambition is not just a career trait. It becomes a personality style. You see it almost immediately. You move here, and within a month you notice that the city is full of people who speak in bullet points, schedule coffee like tactical warfare, and can somehow sound both exhausted and competitive while describing their work week. DC is full of highly functional, highly articulate adults who have mastered the art of sounding casual, while quietly telling you they were on a call with someone whose title has 3 nouns and 2 hyphens in it. Now, before we roast the city too hard, let's state this. A place like Washington should attract ambitious people. It is the seat of the US federal government. National decisions on war, taxation, healthcare, trade, immigration, banking, civil rights, antitrust, and environmental regulation are shaped here. If you are the kind of person who wants to influence systems rather than just survive inside them, DC is rationally attractive, and the city's demographics reflect that. The district remains unusually young, with a median age of 34.9, and it is extraordinarily educated. 64.2% of adults 25 and older have at least a bachelor's degree, while 92.7% have at least finished high school. That is a very dense concentration of smart, career-driven people. But here is the psychological catch. When you pack that many high-achieving people into one symbolic capital, ambition stops being a means and starts becoming an identity. That changes everything. Imagine you are at a DC rooftop event. The drinks are overpriced, the skyline is modest, the conversation is suspiciously polished, and somebody is saying, "Honestly, I'm just trying to have impact," with the kind of facial expression people usually reserve for discussing famine relief. You ask what they do, They answer in a paragraph so carefully shaped that it sounds less like information and more like a personal brand statement. In many cities, your job is part of who you are. In DC, for a lot of people, your job becomes the moral explanation for why you deserve oxygen. That sounds harsh, but it is not entirely their fault. Cities train people through incentives. DC trains people to turn credentials into identity because so much of the local economy rewards symbolic capital, degrees, affiliations, titles, committee access, publications, fellowships, clearances, and institutional association. You do not merely work somewhere, you become legible through where you work. That is why the city is so obsessed with resumes. Not because everyone is shallow, but because in DC resumes are social maps. A person who worked on the Hill, then at a think tank, then at a federal agency, then at a consulting shop is not just listing jobs. They are signalling fluency in the local hierarchy. They are showing they understand the choreography of American power. And once that social coding becomes normal, people start living inside it. This is where ambition becomes psychologically dangerous, because ambition by itself is not a vice. In healthy form, it is disciplined aspiration. It gets good people into hard institutions. It keeps talented workers in public service. It motivates people to read the boring documents that quietly shape millions of lives. Civilization in many ways runs on the labor of ambitious nerds. Bless them. May their annotated PDFs be forever version controlled. The problem is when ambition becomes fused with self-worth, then every meeting becomes existential. Every setback becomes identity injury. Every ignored email becomes a referendum on your value. Every title change feels like either salvation or humiliation. And that mindset gets reinforced by the rhythms of the city. The district has about 324,491 households, but only 1.99 persons per household on average. That is a subtle but revealing number. It suggests a city with many people living alone or in relatively small domestic units, which often means work occupies more emotional real estate. At the same time, only 80.2% of residents lived in the same house 1 year earlier, which points to substantial churn. This is not a city where everyone has deep, lifelong roots. It is a city of arrivals, exits, fellowships, rotations, appointments, campaigns, and we're just here for a few years, becoming 7 years because someone got promoted and then discovered a taste for policy-adjacent sourdough. That churn matters psychologically. When people do not feel rooted in place, they often root themselves more deeply in profession. If home feels temporary, career becomes home. If your friendships are unstable because everyone is forever taking another job, moving agencies, leaving after an election, or fleeing to New York after deciding they are done with politics, then work gives you continuity. It gives structure. It gives language. It gives tribe. The office, the issue area, the cause, the network, these become substitutes for belonging. And that helps explain why DC often feels simultaneously social and lonely. There are endless coffees, panels, receptions, galas, issue briefings, dinners, launch events, post-panel drinks, and small gatherings that somehow have name tags. Yet a lot of people in DC privately describe a city that is hard to emotionally settle into. Because networking is not the same as intimacy. Strategic socializing is not the same as friendship. A packed calendar can hide a thin inner life remarkably well. DC is full of people who can get invited to an embassy reception faster than they can find someone to help them move a couch. And let's talk about commute psychology for a second, because even that contributes to the city's emotional texture. The Census Bureau puts the district's mean travel time to work at 30.0 minutes, higher than the US average. Meanwhile, newer regional and traffic reporting shows congestion worsened in 2025, with the average DC driver losing about 70 hours to traffic over the year. That may sound like a mundane infrastructure complaint, but long commutes and chronic congestion do something important psychologically. They increase stress, fragment attention, and eat away at the hours where human beings normally recover, reflect, and maintain relationships. In a city already optimized for ambition, friction like that amplifies burnout. So what happens when you combine elite education, status competition, weak-rootedness, intense professional identity, and daily low-level stress? You get a city where many people become what I would call performatively composed and privately unsteady. They know how to talk. They know how to frame. They know how to signal intelligence, caution, and moral seriousness. But beneath that polished exterior, a lot of people are deeply unsure whether they matter apart from their usefulness to institutions. That is the darker side of meritocratic cities in general, and DC in particular. The city is extremely good at rewarding competence, but it can also train people to confuse being impressive with being secure. Those are not the same thing. An impressive person can still be emotionally brittle. A successful person can still be spiritually hollow. A celebrated person can still go home and feel like a decorative attachment on someone else's system. And DC gives you lots of opportunities to feel decorative. Think about the middle layers of power. The deputies, councils, staff directors, analysts, comms people, legislative aides, fellows, advisors, consultants, issue specialists, and external affairs people. These are often bright, sincere, industrious people doing meaningful work. But many occupy roles that are very close to power without actually controlling outcomes. And that is a psychologically unstable position. Close enough to feel responsible, not powerful enough to decide, important enough to be stressed, replaceable enough to be disposable. In other words, the perfect recipe for anxious over-identification. This is why so many DC personalities can sound curiously inflated and diminished at the same time. Inflated because they are constantly near the language of national consequence. Diminished because they know, deep down, that many decisions happen above them, beyond them, or around them. They are both actors and stage crew, sometimes in the same meeting. And yes, that creates a certain kind of humour too. DC humour is often dry, procedural, and dead-eyed. It is the humour of people who have read too many memos and no longer trust any sentence containing the phrase interagency coordination. It is the humour of people who know a room can be full of adults with graduate degrees discussing stakeholder alignment for 90 minutes without any stakeholder actually being aligned. The city's satire writes itself because the gap between rhetoric and reality is so often visible in fluorescent lighting. But there is one more layer to this. DC ambition is not just personal, it is moralized. People do not only want to rise, they want to rise in ways that feel justified, so they tell themselves stories. I am not careerist, I am committed. I am not networking, I am coalition building. I am not positioning, I am serving. And again, sometimes this is genuinely true, but in a city like DC, noble motives and self-advancement frequently travel in the same car. The danger is not hypocrisy in the cartoon villain sense. The danger is self-deception in the professional human sense. When the city rewards you for sounding principled, strategic and indispensable all at once, eventually you may not know where your principles end and your career strategy begins. That is why the psychology of Washington is so fascinating. It is not just a city of power. It is a city of people trying to become legible to power without losing themselves in the process. Some manage it, some do not. Some become wiser, some become unbearably earnest, and some become so optimized for ambition that they can no longer tell whether they are living a life or managing a resume with blood pressure. So if Section 1 was about proximity to power, Section 2 is about the price of chasing it. In Washington, ambition does not just shape careers, it rewires identity. And once that happens, the next thing to examine is obvious. Because if your value depends on being seen as smart, serious, connected, and morally articulate, then language itself becomes a weapon, a shield, and a costume. Which means we need to talk about the official dialect of DC. The strange, bloodless, elegant language people use when they want to sound reasonable while quietly fighting for status, protection, or control. 3. The language of plausible virtue. Every powerful city has a dialect. Wall Street has its jargon of positions, exposure, upside, and the market is pricing it in, which is a very elegant way of saying something expensive is happening, and I would prefer not to explain it in plain English. Silicon Valley has its language of building, scaling, optimizing, and changing the world, sometimes by inventing a new app that helps venture-backed adults avoid making eye contact with grocery cashiers. Washington D.C. has its own dialect too, but DC's version is especially interesting because it is designed to do 3 things at once. Make power sound reasonable, make self-interest sound principled, and make conflict sound like process. That is not just a style issue, it is a psychological system. Because in Washington, language is not merely how people communicate, it is how they manage risk, signal status, preserve deniability, and morally sanitize ambition. Imagine you're sitting in a conference room in downtown DC. There is coffee, there are legal pads, there are people with expensive tote bags who somehow look like they have not slept since the previous administration. Someone says, "We want to ensure all stakeholders are aligned before moving forward." That sounds harmless, mature even, responsible. But what might it actually mean? It could mean, we do not have the votes. It could mean, someone powerful objects. It could mean, we are afraid. It could mean, we are buying time. It could mean, we need to figure out how to do this without getting blamed. And the beauty of DC language, beauty in the same way a camouflage net is beautiful if you are hiding artillery, is that it allows people to move through high-stakes environments without speaking too nakedly about power. Governments, courts, legislatures, agencies, embassies, multilateral institutions, and large advocacy coalitions genuinely do require careful language. Precision matters, legal exposure matters, diplomatic signalling matters. In public administration, sloppy wording can trigger lawsuits, market reactions, diplomatic incidents, or policy confusion. A sentence in a regulation or guidance memo can have consequences far beyond the room in which it was drafted. Washington's caution is not always cowardice. Sometimes it's professionalism. Sometimes euphemism is just compression for complex realities, but only sometimes. Because once careful language becomes normalized, it becomes very easy for a city to slide from precision into plausible virtue. A style of speech where almost nobody says exactly what they want, yet everybody somehow knows what game is being played. And DC is one of the global capitals of this art. That should not be surprising. The district is packed with institutions whose very survival depends on strategic framing. Federal agencies, congressional offices, law firms, trade groups, contractors, think tanks, campaign committees, associations, non-profits, watchdogs, media bureaus, and embassies. The city's broader labour market reflects this professional structure. In DC's March 2025 Labour Snapshot, professional scientific and technical services was one of the sectors showing job growth, adding about 1,100 jobs that month. That sounds dry, but psychologically it matters. A city with a huge concentration of analysts, lawyers, policy specialists, researchers, and strategic communicators will naturally develop a speech culture that prizes abstraction, caution, and verbal control. And then there is lobbying. Washington's language culture cannot be separated from the fact that enormous amounts of money are spent trying to shape what government does and how it talks about what it does. According to Open Secrets data, summarized by Reuters, total federal lobbying expenditures had reached about $2.53 billion by July 2025, and major lobbying firms posted sharp gains during policy upheaval in 2025. That number matters because lobbying is not just about persuasion. It is about translation. It is about taking private interests, corporate, sectoral, ideological, institutional, and translating them into public language that sounds legitimate. Nobody walks into a room and says, "Hello, we would like a favourable carve-out that protects our margins and socialises our downside." No, they say things like, "We're concerned about regulatory certainty," or "We want to preserve innovation incentives," or "We're focused on maintaining competitiveness in a rapidly evolving environment." Maybe they are. Sometimes they absolutely are. But language like that also performs a crucial psychological function. It lets people defend narrow interests while experiencing themselves as guardians of the common good. That is the magic trick. And DC rewards people who can perform it elegantly. This is why the city produces so many people who sound thoughtful, balanced, and ethically calibrated even when they are engaged in ruthless bureaucratic combat. Washington conflict is often not loud. It is padded. It arrives in memo form. It comes with tracked changes. It says, "We have some concerns with the current approach," when what it means is, "over my politically dead body." You can hear this everywhere. A scandal becomes a process breakdown. A retreat becomes a strategic recalibration. A failure becomes a messaging challenge. A turf war becomes an interagency coordination issue. A donor demand becomes stakeholder input. A patronage network becomes trusted relationships. A politically motivated delay becomes the need for further review. DC has turned indirection into a civilization, and psychologically, this does something important. It allows people to preserve a positive self-concept while operating inside systems that often involve compromise, opportunism, status competition, and moral ambiguity. That is not trivial. Most human beings do not want to think of themselves as cynical. They want to think of themselves as reasonable. So if a city gives them a dialect that makes every ugly incentive sound responsible, many will use it, not always dishonestly, but often defensively. This is where the city's intellectual culture comes in. Washington has a dense ecosystem of think tanks, research centers, policy institutes, and issue shops. Older think tank indexes consistently found that a very large share of US-based think tanks are concentrated in Washington, with one prominent index putting it at about 1/4 of the national total. Even allowing for the age of those counts, the basic pattern remains. Unmistakable, DC is saturated with institutions that produce briefs, talking points, frameworks, white papers, and policy narratives. That has a psychological consequence. In cities dominated by finance, people become fluent in risk and valuation. In cities dominated by entertainment, people become fluent in visibility and audience. In Washington, people become fluent in framing. They learn how to speak in layers. They learn what to omit. They learn which verbs are dangerous. They learn how to sound decisive without sounding reckless, moral without sounding naive, strategic without sounding manipulative, and partisan without sounding unserious. And once you spend enough years in that environment, you start doing it reflexively. You will hear ordinary people in DC use phrases in casual conversation that would sound faintly insane elsewhere. Somebody won't say, "I disagree." They'll say, "I think there may be some second-order implications we should consider." Somebody won't say, "That plan is terrible." They'll say, "I'm not sure the current approach is fully responsive to the operational realities." Somebody won't say, "He lied." They'll say, "There appears to be tension between the public representation and the underlying record." That last one, by the way, is how you know you have lived in DC too long. You stop accusing people of nonsense directly and start sounding like a bipartisan report no one will read. Now, again, some of this is genuinely useful. High-stakes work requires calibration, but DC also uses language for status sorting. The more fluently you can speak the city's dialect, the more legible you become as an insider. People who speak too plainly can be seen as unserious, unsophisticated, too emotional, too ideological, too green, or just not of the culture. In that sense, language functions like a dress code for the mind. And all dress codes exclude someone. This is especially important in a city that already has deep inequality. The district's official poverty rate remains high, even alongside high incomes and elite concentrations. That means Washington's public language often floats above a social reality that is much harsher on the ground. The city can speak endlessly in abstract nouns: equity, resilience, inclusion, growth, governance, while many residents are dealing with rent burdens, job instability, neighborhood disparities, and an economy shaped by institutions they do not control. That gap between language and life is not just politically frustrating, it is psychologically corrosive. Because when official speech becomes too polished, people stop trusting it. When every sentence sounds pre-sanitized, sincerity becomes harder to detect. And when citizens can no longer tell whether leaders are speaking clearly or merely speaking safely, cynicism rises. You can see some of that in the broader national mood around institutions, but DC residents feel it locally too. A city can be full of very intelligent people and still struggle with credibility if its language starts sounding more like brand management than truth-telling. And the incentives for brand management are strong. In 2025, the district's labour market was dealing with federal employment shocks and rising unemployment pressure, with AP reporting that DC had the highest unemployment rate in the country for multiple months in mid-2025. In a city under that kind of strain, people and institutions become even more cautious, because every public statement may affect funding, politics, hiring, investor expectations, or media narratives. So the language gets even more careful, and as the language gets more careful, it often gets less human. This is one reason DC can feel emotionally weird. The city is full of people discussing life-altering topics: war, deportation, surveillance, inflation, housing, Medicaid, antitrust, civil liberties, in tones so measured they sometimes sound like they are discussing office carpet samples. That emotional flattening is partly professional training, but it is also a defense mechanism. If you felt the full moral and human weight of every policy file on your desk all the time, you would probably combust by Thursday. So people distance themselves, they abstract, they proceduralize, they turn flesh into framework. That is the hidden psychology of DC language. It is not only about deception or elitism, it is also about emotional survivability, but the cost is real. Because a city that overuses sanitized language risks producing people who can no longer speak honestly even to themselves. They learn to call ambition service, fear caution, submission process, silence neutrality, and political calculation prudence. And once you do that long enough, your internal life starts sounding like a public affairs memo. That is when the soul of the city gets strange. You have people who are brilliant but guarded, principled but strategic, empathetic but abstracted, moral but career conscious, communicative but not always truthful in the deepest human sense. Not liars exactly, just professionally laundered. And if that sounds too harsh, remember, Washington does not invent human weakness. It institutionalizes it with excellent grammar. So here is the key takeaway from this section. The language of Washington D.C. is not just a way of talking. It is a technology of self-protection. It protects institutions from risk, professionals from exposure, and ambitious people from having to describe power too plainly. It helps the city function. It also helps the city hide. And once a city becomes fluent in hiding itself through language, the next thing you have to study is the social life built on top of that language. Because if everyone is speaking in calibrated tones, signaling relevance, and trying not to reveal too much too directly, then friendship, romance, networking, and trust all start to blur together. Which brings us to one of DC's most revealing rituals, the performance of connection. And yes, we are finally going to talk about networking, the city's favourite hobby, unofficial religion, and most socially acceptable form of mild predation. 4. Networking as a survival skill. If Washington, D.C. had an official city sport, it would not be baseball. It would be professionalised socialising, not friendship, not community, not exactly manipulation either, at least not in the cartoon sense. Something subtler, something more polished. Something DC has elevated into both craft and civic weather pattern. The constant conversion of human contact into future optionality. You feel it fast. You move to Washington. Someone says, "We should grab coffee." In most cities, that means one of three things. They like you, they are being polite, or they are bored. In DC, it can also mean, "I would like to assess your relevance, exchange information, maintain a weak tie, and preserve the possibility that one day you might become useful to me or someone I know." And the wild part is, this is not entirely irrational. Washington is a city with about 702,250 residents, a median age of 34.9, and a very high concentration of people in government, policy, law, advocacy, consulting, research, and media. It is young, educated, mobile, and heavily institutional. Those conditions naturally create a culture where relationships matter unusually much. In places where decisions flow through bureaucracies, committees, offices, gatekeepers, and informal trust networks, knowing people is not a side activity. It is part of how the city actually works. Networking in DC is not always fake. Sometimes it is genuinely how people find jobs, solve public problems, move legislation, coordinate between institutions, build coalitions, and get competent people into important rooms. If you work in a city where policy can stall because the right office never got looped in, or a grant can die because no one knew which program staff to call, then relationships are part of competence. A healthy network can mean quicker problem solving, better information flow, and more trust across sectors. In other words, DC networking is not merely vanity, it is also infrastructure. But the psychology gets weird when a survival skill becomes a social philosophy. Because then people stop asking, "Do I like this person?" and start asking, often unconsciously, where do they sit in the ecosystem? That is when a city begins turning relationships into maps of strategic possibility, and Washington is almost optimized for that. The district has roughly 329,687 households, with about 2 persons per household, which reflects a city full of small households, solo living, and relatively thin domestic units compared with many other parts of the country. At the same time, only 80.2% of residents lived in the same house a year earlier, which points to notable churn. This is a city of arrivals, exits, fellowships, appointments, campaign cycles, temporary contracts, and people who came for just 2 years and then accidentally built an entire adult identity around panel invitations and overpriced wine in Shore. Psychologically, that churn matters a lot, because when people do not feel rooted, they often overinvest in weak ties. Not deep ties, weak ties. The sociologist Mark Granovetter famously argued that weak ties are incredibly valuable because they connect people to new information, jobs, and opportunities. Washington is basically a citywide masterclass in that principle. The problem is that weak ties are excellent for career mobility and terrible as a substitute for intimacy. 100 strategic acquaintances can still leave you lonely. A full calendar can still hide an emotionally empty week. That is why DC can feel hypersocial and strangely isolated at the same time. There are endless coffees, receptions, think tank events, policy happy hours, alumni mixers, embassy gatherings, launch parties, issue briefings, and post-panel drinks. Georgetown even maintains dedicated guides to the city's dense ecosystem of think tanks and NGOs, which tells you something about how structurally embedded these institutions are in local life. Washington does not just have a few networking venues, it has an entire social architecture built around policy-adjacent visibility. Imagine you're at one of these events. The room is buzzing. Everyone is carrying themselves with just enough urgency to imply they left something important to be here. Someone asks what you do. You answer. They nod. Then comes the microscopic pause where their brain runs a silent calculation. Can this person help me now? Later? Indirectly? Do they know someone I should know? Are they ascending? Are they attached to a name, office, outlet, or donor network that matters? Nobody says this aloud, obviously. Washington is too elegant for that. But the calculation is often there. And once enough people do that often enough, the city develops a very distinctive emotional temperature. Pleasant but appraising. That phrase captures a lot of DC social life. People are often charming. They are also scanning. They are warm. They are also sorting. They are curious. They are also indexing. Again, not because everyone is a villain, because incentives teach attention. If your city is filled with institutions where jobs are scarce, appointments are political, promotions depend on sponsorship, and entire sectors rise and fall with elections or federal budget decisions, then relationships become a hedge against instability. And DC has had plenty of instability recently. In late 2025, the district lost 18,400 jobs between September and October, and another 600 in November, with local fiscal analysts saying much of the decline was driven by federal job losses tied to workforce reduction efforts. Brookings reported that the broader DC, Maryland, Virginia region ended 2025 with roughly 56,000 fewer jobs than a year earlier, and that about 96% of those losses stemmed directly from federal layoffs. Now think about what job insecurity does socially. It makes people defensive. It makes them maintain connections more aggressively. It makes them more likely to go to the event they do not want to attend, reply to the coffee request they do not care about, and laugh a little harder at the joke told by the person whose office might matter in 6 months. This is how networking stops being optional and starts feeling like preventive maintenance. And because DC wraps so much of its ambition in civic or moral language, even networking often gets rebranded in noble terms. People are not working the room. They are building relationships. They are not social climbing. They are creating cross-sector dialogue. They are not staying visible because they fear professional disappearance. They are investing in community. Sometimes that is true. Sometimes it is also a very polite lie people tell themselves so their ambition feels less naked. That self-story matters, because most people want to experience themselves as decent. They do not want to think, I am curating human interactions for career leverage. They would much rather think, I am cultivating meaningful professional relationships. The first sounds predatory. The second sounds mature. Washington, as always, prefers the version of reality with better branding, and that has consequences for trust. Because if enough relationships in a city carry even a faint undertone of strategic evaluation, then everybody becomes slightly guarded. You start noticing that some conversations are really interviews in disguise, some invitations are reconnaissance, some compliments are soft openings, some friendships are authentic until one person becomes politically inconvenient, professionally irrelevant, or simply no longer useful to the network. That sounds cynical, but the cynicism itself is part of the psychology. DC trains people to expect instrumental motives because instrumental motives are common enough to become ambient, and once a population starts assuming hidden calculations behind ordinary warmth, sincerity becomes harder to recognize. This is one reason transplants often describe Washington as harder to crack emotionally than expected. On the surface, the city is full of opportunities to meet people. Underneath, many of those interactions are shaped by role consciousness. Everyone knows everyone may someday matter. That makes spontaneity feel expensive, and it affects romance too. DC dating has a particular reputation for a reason. A city full of highly educated, career-forward adults with fluctuating schedules, symbolic status hierarchies, and low-rootedness will naturally produce a dating market where jobs, ambition, office affiliation, and political worldview are unusually salient. The city's median age, small household structure, and transient professional churn all reinforce that dynamic. You're not just dating a person, you're often dating a schedule, a mission, a network, and an implicit theory of the Republic. And yes, this can get absurd. Only in Washington can someone tell you over cocktails that they are taking a break from dating to focus on the transition, and have that sentence somehow make perfect sense. There is also a class dimension here that should not be ignored. The city's polished networking culture exists alongside deep inequality. The district's median household income is $109,870, but 17.3% of residents live in poverty. That means large parts of the city are moving through completely different realities. The networking rituals of policy professionals, non-profit managers, Hill staffers, consultants, lawyers, journalists and analysts are not the culture in any universal sense. They are the culture of a very specific stratum, the institutionally networked class. That matters because elites often mistake their social habits for normal life. In Washington especially, people can start to believe receptions, coffees, issue briefings, panels, and carefully maintained contact lists are just what adulthood looks like. They are not. They are what adulthood looks like inside a city whose labour market is unusually concentrated around power and knowledge work. And once you see that, a lot of DC behaviour becomes easier to decode. Why are people so overbooked? Because visibility has value. Why do people keep grabbing coffee with near strangers? Because optionality has value. Why do they maintain vague but cordial ties with people they do not especially enjoy? Because future access has value. Why do they sometimes seem warm but curiously unavailable? Because in DC, being socially open and emotionally exposed are two very different things. Now, to be fair, not everyone submits to this logic. Plenty of Washington residents build real communities, deep friendships, religious communities, neighborhood ties, artistic circles, family-centered lives, or non-instrumental social worlds that resist the city's professionalization of everything. Those people are often the healthiest people in town. They are the ones who remember that human beings are not networking nodes, and that being known matters more than being connected. But resisting the logic of the city takes effort, because the city constantly rewards the opposite. It rewards responsiveness, it rewards visibility, it rewards strategic friendliness, it rewards being in rooms, it rewards becoming socially memorable to the right people, and if you're young, ambitious, and still climbing, those rewards can feel almost impossible to ignore. So here is the real psychological heart of this section. Networking in Washington is not just career behaviour, it is adaptation to a city where institutions dominate social reality. People learn to turn relationships into insurance, information channels, and future leverage because the system teaches them that staying socially legible is part of staying economically and professionally alive. The practice is often rational. The emotional residue is often exhausting, which is why so many people in DC eventually hit a wall. They realize they know hundreds of people and trust very few. They have a busy phone and a quiet inner life. They are professionally visible and personally undernourished. They can get into the reception, but not necessarily into real belonging. That is when the deeper question appears. If the city turns connection into currency, what does it do to morality? What happens when good intentions, career incentives, public language, and personal ambition all start mixing inside the same institutional ecosystem? That is where Washington becomes more than competitive. That is where it becomes theatrical. Because the next thing we need to examine is the city's most delicate and explosive psychological mechanism of all, the performance of virtue. 5. Virtue as performance, performance as power. Washington, D.C. does not just run on ambition, language, and networking. It also runs on moral display. And to be very clear, that does not mean nobody in D.C. believes in anything. Quite the opposite. One reason the city is so psychologically intense is because many people here are genuinely principled. They really do care about democracy, civil rights, labour rights, national security, healthcare, climate policy, reproductive rights, immigration, religious liberty, tax fairness, anti-corruption work, and constitutional limits. Washington attracts true believers, not just opportunists. That is exactly why the city becomes so fascinating and so dangerous. Because when you mix real conviction with career incentives, institutional status, media visibility, and symbolic language, you get a place where virtue is often sincere and strategic at the same time. That duality is the heart of DC. Imagine you're in a room full of highly educated professionals discussing justice, democracy, or national security. Some are absolutely there because they believe in the cause. Some are there because the cause is now their profession. Some are there because they believe and because it is their profession. And some are there because they know that in Washington, being seen on the right side of the right issue at the right moment can reshape a career. The unsettling part is that from the outside, these people can look almost identical. That is why DC moral culture often feels so hard to decode. A democratic capital should have moral argument. It should be full of advocacy, civic passion, and public pressure. Without people making ethical claims in Washington, the city would be even worse, just a cold administrative machine with prettier monuments. You want activists, public interest lawyers, watchdog groups, reformers, whistleblowers, union advocates, civil rights organizations, anti-corruption researchers, and hard-headed policy people who still care about principle. The district's non-profit infrastructure reflects that density. Independent Sector's DC profile lists 12,367 non-profit organizations in the district, including 8,024 public charities. That is a massive moral industrial ecosystem packed into one small jurisdiction. But here is the problem. Once moral language becomes a normal part of professional life, it can start functioning as status currency. And Washington knows how to mint that currency beautifully. A person does not just say, "I want this job." They say, "I care deeply about this mission." A group does not just want influence, it wants to center impacted communities. A consultant does not just want the contract, they want to support equitable implementation. A politician does not just want donor backing, they want to fight for working families or defend freedom, depending on which side of the aisle is paying for the mailers. Again, sometimes these claims are absolutely true, sometimes they are partly true. Sometimes they are what people say when naked self-interest would sound too ugly under fluorescent lighting. That ambiguity is not accidental, it is useful. Because moral language does something extraordinary in a city like DC, it allows ambition to dress itself as conscience. And that matters in a place where influence is everything. Reuters reported that lobbying expenditures reached about $2.53 billion by July 2025, and major Washington lobbying firms posted record gains as policy fights intensified. In other words, enormous amounts of money are constantly flowing through a city that also speaks non-stop in the language of public good, public duty, and public service. That is not hypocrisy in a simple cartoon sense, it is a structural contradiction. Washington contains people trying to improve the country and people trying to bend the country toward their own interests. Very often those Groups use overlapping language. Sometimes they even attend the same panels, quote the same values, and drink the same mediocre event wine under the same banner about inclusive democracy or responsible innovation. The city is uniquely skilled at creating rooms where radically different motives wear similarly tasteful clothing. And psychologically, this produces a very specific behavior pattern. People become highly attuned to moral signaling. They start watching not just what others believe, but how publicly, how elegantly, and how advantageously they believe it. They notice who is early to a position, and who arrives once it is safe. They notice who is brave when power is against them, and who is brave only after the memo circulates. They notice who sounds ethical in public and transactional in private. This turns morality itself into a competitive arena. Not always, not everywhere, but often enough that people start sensing it. That is one reason DC can feel so performative even when many of the people are intelligent and earnest. The city does not merely reward being right, it rewards being seen being right, especially in ways that are legible to institutions, funders, colleagues, party factions, media ecosystems, and professional tribes. And once being seen matters that much, virtue starts to develop stagecraft. You can hear it in the cadence of public speech, the polished statement, the carefully timed condemnation, the calibrated letter signed by the proper people, the panel discussion where everyone agrees in progressively more sophisticated language, the social media post that sounds like ethics wrapped in branding, the internal concern raised only after the risk is reputationally manageable, the sudden emergence of principle at exactly the moment principle becomes institutionally profitable. Washington is not the only city that does this. It may simply be the city most fluent in it, and the broader national environment makes this worse. Pew reported in late 2025 that public trust in the federal government remained near historic lows, and that partisan trust had become sharply polarized. Only 9% of Democrats and 26% of Republicans said they trusted the federal government always, or most of the time in that survey. In a low-trust national atmosphere, moral performance becomes even more valuable, because institutions and actors are under constant pressure to prove legitimacy, sincerity, and alignment. Think about what that does inside Washington. If trust is scarce, signaling becomes more intense. If legitimacy is contested, branding becomes more elaborate. If everyone suspects everyone else of hidden motives, then people lean harder into visible virtue. This does not always produce honesty. Often it produces ritualized righteousness. You see this in organizations too. A non-profit, agency, advocacy group, firm, or policy shop may genuinely care about justice, fairness, equity, transparency, or accountability. It may also care very much about grants, media perception, donor retention, Hill relationships, access to appointees, coalition discipline, and not getting destroyed online by its own side. These concerns are not mutually exclusive. In Washington, they are often fused. That fusion can create admirable discipline. It can also create moral cowardice. Because once every statement has reputational consequences, people become cautious about telling uncomfortable truths that cut against their team, coalition, donor base, or career path. They do not want to be wrong, obviously, but more than that, many do not want to be socially unaffiliated, and in DC, isolation can be professionally fatal. So silence gets renamed prudence, opportunism gets renamed timing, conformity gets renamed responsibility. This is where a city of ethics starts drifting into theatre. And theatre is not the same as lying. Theatre means roles, scripts, audiences, timing, blocking, costume. It means people often know what kind of moral performance is expected in a given room and can deliver it with startling fluency. A national security room has one moral register, a non-profit fundraising room has another, a campaign war room has another, a law firm-hosted policy breakfast has another. Washington professionals learn to code switch across all of them. That skill can be useful. It can also hollow people out. Because if you spend enough time performing alignment, eventually you may not know whether your convictions are fully yours or partly inherited from the ecosystems you need to survive in. You start asking fewer dangerous questions. You become smoother, more legible, more employable, less free. And that is one of the city's darkest psychological costs, not corruption, in the suitcase full of cash sense, not even always dishonesty, something quieter, moral adaptation, the slow reshaping of one's conscience around the reward structure of institutions. This happens on every side: left, right, centre, reformist, establishment, activist, technocratic, populist, hawkish, dovish, non-profit, private sector, media, government. DC does not have a monopoly on one ideology. What it has is a powerful machinery for rewarding people who can package their incentives in the language of civic necessity. And to be fair, many people fight against this machinery. Some whistleblow, some resign, some tell the truth when it is costly, some refuse the script, some remain grounded enough to separate their beliefs from their career incentives. Those are often the most morally impressive people in Washington, not because they are loud, but because they are willing to pay a price for not performing. But the city as a system often rewards the opposite. It rewards people who are disciplined, legible, coalition-safe, and rhetorically impeccable. It rewards those who know when to speak, when to delay, when to frame, when to condemn, when to soften, and when to say absolutely nothing while quietly waiting for the internal winds to shift. And because Washington is also a media city, these performances often get amplified. Journalists, spokespeople, think tankers, Hill staff, campaign professionals, agency communicators, researchers, and activists are all part of a feedback loop in which moral framing quickly becomes public currency. A phrase catches on. A line becomes the accepted summary. A concept becomes a badge. A coalition adopts it. Soon an entire ecosystem is repeating a moral position with subtle variations, and everyone inside it feels both principled and socially synchronized. That can mobilize real reform. It can also produce what feels from the outside like a city talking to itself in morally elevated slogans. And ordinary residents can feel the disconnect. Washington is a city with huge wealth and prestige, but also deep strain, inequality, and instability. The district still has a high poverty rate, and recent labour shocks tied to federal cuts hit the metro area hard. When official and professional classes keep speaking in polished moral abstractions, while lived reality remains jagged, citizens do not just become frustrated, they become suspicious. That suspicion feeds the cycle even more. Institutions sense distrust, so they communicate more carefully. Careful communication sounds more produced. Produced language increases distrust. Distrust increases the need for more visible virtue, and around it goes. So here is the crucial point. Washington, D.C. is not full of fake moralists. It is full of people operating in a system where morality is both conviction and currency. That is a much harder thing to live with. It means many people are neither saints nor frauds. They are professionals navigating a city where the line between ethics and self-interest is constantly negotiated in public. That is why D.C. can feel so exhausting. Everyone is not just fighting over policy, they are fighting over the right to define what counts as virtue, what counts as seriousness, what counts as responsibility, and who gets to wear those labels without being laughed out of the room. And once a city starts treating morality as theatre, something else inevitably happens. People burn out, not just because the work is hard, not just because the hours are long, but because living in permanent symbolic combat, where your beliefs, your language, your tribe, your reputation, and your future are all intertwined, creates a special kind of emotional fatigue. Which means the next thing we need to examine is not power, ambition, language, networking, or virtue. It is what all of that does to the human nervous system. Because Washington is not only a city of influence, it is a city of managed anxiety. 6. Managed anxiety as a lifestyle. Washington, D.C. is one of the few cities in America where stress often arrives dressed as professionalism. It does not always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks polished, efficient, composed. It looks like somebody answering emails at 10:47 p.m. with impeccable punctuation. It looks like a person saying, "It's been a little hectic," when what they mean is that their nervous system has been living on espresso, outrage, and calendar alerts since February. It looks like someone carrying 3 phones, 2 identities, and 1 facial expression. Alert, but emotionally unavailable. That is the hidden emotional operating system of Washington. Not panic, not chaos, not even ordinary burnout. at least not at first. Managed anxiety, the kind that becomes so normalized it starts to feel like maturity. DC is not anxious for no reason. This is a place where policy decisions affect millions of lives, where jobs often depend on elections, appropriations, media cycles, agency shifts or leadership changes, and where many people work in institutions built around risk, scrutiny, deadlines, and public consequence. Some anxiety in Washington is simply the emotional cost of being close to systems that matter. A city of legislators, lawyers, journalists, federal workers, contractors, analysts, diplomats, and advocates is going to be more keyed up than a beach town selling smoothies and emotional detachment. The problem is not that DC has stress. The problem is that it institutionalizes stress. By mid-2025, that stress had concrete economic reasons. The district had the highest unemployment rate in the country in July 2025 at 6.0%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. An AP reported Washington held the highest unemployment rate in the nation for multiple consecutive months in 2025, as federal workforce cuts rippled through the city. That matters psychologically because job insecurity does not stay neatly inside the labour market. It leaks into identity, housing decisions, relationships, and baseline emotional tone. In a city where so many careers are tied directly or indirectly to federal spending, appointments, contracts, policy priorities, and political turnover, people do not just worry about work. They worry about whether the institution around which they built their entire adult life will still want them 6 months from now. That is not ordinary workplace stress. That is existential instability wearing a government badge, and the city's cost structure makes that instability sharper. Census Quick Facts list the district's median gross rent at $1,954, while USA Facts estimates median renter households in DC spent about 30.7% of income on rent in 2024, already a meaningful burden before you add student loans, childcare, transportation, and the social cost of living in a city where everybody seems one promotion away from a nicer apartment and better lighting. So imagine the emotional arithmetic. You live in an expensive city. Your job is tied to a volatile institutional ecosystem. Your peers are high-achieving and visibly anxious. Your social life is partially professional. Your status is unstable. Your future may hinge on policy shifts you do not control. Of course, people in Washington become hyper-vigilant. And then the commute gets involved, because apparently the city wanted a few extra points in ambient suffering. Census data puts the district's mean travel time to work at roughly 30 minutes, and INRIX's 2025 scorecard found the average DC driver lost about 70 hours to traffic congestion in 2025, up from 2024. That kind of friction matters more than people think. Long, uncertain commutes do not just waste time, they erode recovery time, raise irritability, and make every day feel slightly pre-stolen before work even begins, then layer in the return to office shock. In January 2025, the White House ordered executive agencies to end remote work arrangements and require employees to return in person as soon as practicable. And by June 2025, OPM was already warning DC area federal workers to expect delays and to allow extra travel time because of major disruptions. That means many workers were not only dealing with political and professional uncertainty, but also a structural rewrite of how daily life worked. This is how Washington creates what feels like a citywide emotional posture of permanent readiness. People monitor emails because leadership might move. They monitor news because markets, agencies, courts, or campaigns might shift. They monitor group chats because the wording of a statement might suddenly matter. They monitor themselves because one bad meeting, one wrong line, one mistimed public comment, one ill-judged post, one reorg, one election, one budget fight, pick your poison, can have consequences that feel wildly disproportional. And because DC is full of smart adults, they often cope by intellectualizing the stress. They do not say, "I feel unsafe." They say, "There's a lot of uncertainty in the operating environment." They do not say, "I'm overwhelmed." They say, "We're managing a lot of moving pieces right now." Washington is very good at converting human distress into language that sounds like a briefing memo. That is part of how the city keeps functioning, but functioning is not the same as being well. National mental health data helps explain why this atmosphere hits so hard. The American Psychiatric Association's 2025 poll found that Americans remain highly anxious, and the American Psychological Association's 2025 Stress in America report found that 69% of adults cited misinformation as a major stressor and 62% cited current events. In a city where people are not merely consuming current events, but often working inside them, that broader national stress gets concentrated and professionalized. That is why Washington can feel emotionally heavier than its size suggests. It is not just that the city deals in serious topics. It is that the people who live there often cannot fully leave those topics at the office. In many other places, politics is something you check on. In DC, politics can become the weather, the economy, the dating filter, the friend group fault line, and the reason your Tuesday disappeared. This creates a strange feedback loop. The city rewards responsiveness, so people stay plugged in. Staying plugged in increases stress. Stress makes people more reactive and less reflective. Reaction gets mistaken for engagement. Engagement gets rewarded socially and professionally, so people stay even more plugged in. At some point, anxiety stops feeling like a warning signal and starts feeling like proof you care. That is one of Washington's most dangerous moral confusions. If you are calm, are you disengaged? If you unplug, are you unserious? If you do not speak immediately, are you complicit? If you're not visibly exhausted, are you maybe not important enough? This is how a city teaches people to confuse depletion with virtue. And again, plenty of people resist this. Some build boundaries, some protect weekends, some anchor themselves in family, faith, neighborhoods, art, exercise, or communities that have nothing to do with federal churn. Those people tend to age better in Washington, emotionally speaking. They realize something essential. Institutions will always imply that everything is urgent. Most of it is not equally urgent to the human soul, but many people do not learn that lesson early. Instead, they drift into a lifestyle where anxiety becomes social proof. Being slammed means you matter. Being in demand means you are safe. Being exhausted means you are still in motion. The body pays the price, of course. Sleep gets worse, relationships flatten, patience thins, joy becomes scheduled recreation, even leisure turns into optimization, networking disguised as dinner, fitness disguised as resilience strategy, vacation disguised as time to reset before the next push. That last phrase, by the way, is pure DC. Nobody here rests. They reset, which is a very tidy way of saying, I am temporarily pretending to be a mammal again, and the city itself reflects the strain. Downtown office space has been under visible pressure, with major commercial reports showing DC office vacancy above 22% by late 2025. That is not just a real estate number, it is a visual cue that the city's work rhythms, commuting patterns, and institutional geography are still unsettled. When the physical city looks half transitioning and the employment base feels unstable, uncertainty becomes environmental. So what does all of this do to personality? It makes people sharper, but also more brittle. More competent, but often less spacious. More informed, but not always wiser. More connected, but not necessarily more grounded. Washington produces a lot of adults who are excellent at crisis posture. They can speak calmly in chaos. They can summarize a mess in 3 bullets. They can survive ambiguity. But many are privately carrying a level of chronic tension that would look alarming if it were not so elegantly dressed. That is why outsiders sometimes misread DC residents as cold, intense, or oddly performative. Often what they are seeing is not arrogance, it is compression. A person who's been living in sustained institutional alertness tends to speak faster, relax less, scan more, and trust slowness less. Washington teaches people to anticipate the next ask before the current ask is done. It trains them into mental preemption, useful at work, terrible for inner peace. So here is the core truth of this section. Washington, D.C. is a city where anxiety often becomes culture before anyone names it as anxiety. It gets absorbed into the walk, the tone, the inbox, the scheduling habits, the speech patterns, the posture, and the social rules. It is not always visible as breakdown. Often it appears as competence, which is exactly why it is so dangerous, because a city can survive on managed anxiety for a long time. But the longer it does, the more it risks producing people who are professionally durable and personally depleted. And that leads to the next question. If DC runs on ambition, status, language, networking, virtue, and chronic alertness, what kind of people rise highest inside it? Who actually thrives in this environment? And what traits does the city reward, even when it pretends not to? That is where Washington gets really revealing, because the city loves to talk about ideals, but its deepest loyalties are often to temperament. 7. The temperament Washington actually rewards. Washington, D.C. talks constantly about ideals, service, principle, courage, innovation, justice, democracy, duty. And to be fair, those ideals matter. They are not fake words. Many people in this city genuinely organise their lives around them. But if you want to understand DC psychologically, you have to ask a more uncomfortable question. What kind of temperament does the city actually reward day after day under pressure? Not what it praises in speeches, not what it prints in mission statements. What it rewards. And the answer is both revealing and a little bleak. Washington tends to reward people who are disciplined, verbally controlled, status-aware, strategically patient, institutionally fluent, and emotionally calibrated. In other words, the people who rise here are often not the loudest, not the smartest in any abstract sense, and not even always the most principled. They are the ones who know how to survive inside systems without getting emotionally chewed up by them too early. That is a very specific personality ecosystem. Large institutions need adults who can manage complexity, work through procedure, tolerate ambiguity, and communicate carefully. You do not want a central bank run by adrenaline junkies, a national security apparatus run by improvisational poets, or an appropriations process run by people whose only leadership philosophy is vibes. Government, law, policy, and diplomacy require restraint. They require people who can delay gratification, track details, endure meetings, read long documents, and function under scrutiny. Washington's labour structure reflects that institutional bias. The district remains unusually young and highly educated, with a median age of 34.9, and it has an especially large millennial presence shaping the local economy. The city's labour force participation was 72.4% in April 2025, unusually high by national standards. That is not a lazy city. It is a city full of high-functioning human planners. But here is where the psychology gets interesting. Because Washington does not merely reward intelligence. It rewards controlled intelligence. It rewards the person who can sit in a room, understand that three conflicting incentives are colliding, and speak in a way that offends nobody too early. It rewards the person who knows when to hold a position quietly, when to release it, when to soften it, when to say, "We're evaluating all options," and when to disappear behind process until the political weather changes. In many cities, charisma can compensate for instability. In Washington, instability is expensive. The city is more impressed by composure than by brilliance. That is why DC often elevates a particular kind of adult. Not necessarily the bold visionary, but the credible operator. The operator understands timing. The operator understands hierarchy. The operator understands what can be said publicly, privately, or not at all. The operator understands that half of power is substance, and the other half is not frightening the institution that might one day promote you. This is especially true in a city under stress. The district's labour market has been absorbing serious federal downsizing. Local fiscal analysts reported that by November 2025, federal jobs in the district had fallen to 87.7% of their January 2025 level, and the broader DC region ended 2025 with the steepest regional job loss among major US metros, with Brookings attributing roughly 96% of that decline to federal layoffs. In a city facing that kind of volatility, institutions become even more conservative about whom they trust. They tend to reward people who are low drama, highly legible, and safe under pressure. So what traits flourish? First, emotional regulation. Washington rewards people who can absorb stress without visibly spilling it onto the furniture. That does not mean they are not stressed. Often they are extremely stressed, but they can metabolize pressure into polished competence. They know how to look calm in a room full of partial information and concealed panic. That is not fake. It is a survival adaptation. Second, verbal discipline. We already talked about DC's language culture, but here it becomes a personality filter. The city rewards people who can say less than they know, more than they feel, and exactly enough to remain credible. People who are too blunt may be seen as reckless, too passionate, and they may be marked as unserious, too candid, and they may become professionally radioactive. DC likes people whose words arrive with rounded corners. Third, hierarchical sensitivity. Washington is a city of titles, offices, committees, chains of review, and invisible influence networks. People who do well here tend to have a strong instinct for organizational topography. They understand who matters, who merely appears to matter, who can block, who can bless, who can delay, and who needs to feel consulted. This is not necessarily cynical. It is often just functional literacy in a city made of layered institutions. Fourth, strategic patience. In startup culture, speed is worshipped. In Washington, speed can get you fired, isolated, or invited to a hearing for the wrong reasons. DC often rewards people who know how to wait, build consensus, endure frustration, and advance incrementally. The city likes adults who can live with unresolved tension for long periods without flipping the table. That is psychologically costly, but institutionally useful. Fifth, identity flexibility inside stable branding. This sounds contradictory, but it is central to Washington. The most successful people here often maintain a clear outer identity: serious, principled, mission-driven, professional, while being highly adaptive underneath. They can shift tone across administrations, sectors, coalitions, or donor environments without looking like they're shape-shifting. That is a genuine skill. It can also, over time, start resembling elegant self-erasure. Now notice what traits can struggle in this system. People who are morally intense in a direct, unprocessed way. People who say the obvious thing too early. People who need quick closure. People who want clean answers in dirty institutions. People who are talented but dislike hierarchy. People who care deeply but cannot pretend not to care for tactical reasons. People whose nervous systems are not built for permanent alertness and layered speech. Washington can still use such people. Sometimes, it even celebrates them briefly, but it often has a harder time absorbing them. The city prefers personalities it can operationalize, and there is a class dimension to this too. The professional culture we are describing belongs mainly to the institutionally networked parts of DC, government, law, policy, media, non-profits, consulting, and adjacent sectors. The district also contains very different labor realities, yet those elite sectors carry disproportionate symbolic power, so their preferred temperament gets mistaken for the city's natural character. It is not. It is the character of a capital built around knowledge work, institutional navigation, and proximity to federal authority. The city's economic data reflects that concentration. Sectors like professional and technical services were still adding jobs in early 2025, even as the broader labor climate weakened, reinforcing the local premium on specialized, controlled white-collar competence. This is also why DC can feel so weirdly adult. Not mature, necessarily. Adult. The city is full of people who learned early that impulsiveness is dangerous, messiness is costly, and visible neediness is unattractive, so they become polished, self-monitoring, contained, capable. They build what looks like impressive stability, and many do become genuinely formidable professionals. But the shadow side is that a city full of overregulated adults can become emotionally dry. People get better at signaling steadiness than at living openly. That is when competence starts mutating into armor, and armor has benefits. It helps you survive a hearing, a negotiation, a press inquiry, a policy reversal, a leadership purge, a bad election, a funding scare, or a career pivot. But armor also narrows personality. It makes spontaneity feel risky. It makes emotional candor feel expensive. It teaches people to manage the room before they ask themselves what they actually feel. Washington rewards that more than it admits. It is not accidental that the city produces so many people who seem simultaneously impressive and hard to know. The traits DC rewards in public life are not always the traits that deepen friendship, romance, playfulness, or inner ease. A person can thrive professionally in Washington by becoming more composed, more adaptive, more strategic, and less interruptible. those same traits can make them harder to reach emotionally. And when those people succeed, the city reads their survival style as merit. That is one of the great confusions of capitals everywhere. The system mistakes the traits it finds manageable for the traits that are universally admirable. Washington especially can confuse institutional fitness with character. But being excellent at surviving bureaucratic power structures does not necessarily mean you are wise, whole, brave, warm, or free. It may just mean you are optimized for a very specific game. A harsh comparison might help. Think of DC as a giant reef. D, ecosystem. The fish that thrive there are not necessarily the biggest or most beautiful. They are the ones adapted to the currents, the predators, the visibility rules, and the food supply. Washington works similarly. The people who rise are often those best adapted to procedure, reputational risk, and symbolic conflict. They know how to move without attracting the wrong attention. They know when to flash colour and when to blend into the coral. That is not a moral condemnation. It is an ecological observation, and it helps explain why the city can frustrate outsiders. People arrive expecting that intelligence and principle alone will be enough. Then they discover the city also rewards timing, polish, emotional containment, coalition awareness, and the ability to stay useful without becoming too combustible. In other words, Washington rewards not just what you know or believe, but how safely you can carry it. So here is the key takeaway. The temperament Washington actually rewards is not raw brilliance or raw conviction. It is controlled capability under institutional pressure. The city loves people who can stay legible, useful, and composed inside ambiguity. That makes it effective in some ways. It also means DC can quietly sideline some of the most honest, unvarnished, and morally direct personalities, the very people who sometimes see the truth earliest. And once you understand that, another question appears. If Washington rewards controlled temperament, layered speech, strategic friendship, moral performance, and chronic self-management, what happens to the city's actual relationship with ordinary reality? What happens when a place becomes so fluent in institutions that it starts drifting away from everyday life? That is where Washington becomes not just intense, but insulated. And that insulation may be the most psychologically important thing about the city of all. 8. The bubble. When a capital stops feeling like a country. Washington. DC is a city built to speak for a nation. That is part of what makes it so psychologically strange when it starts speaking mostly to itself. Because one of the deepest truths about DC is that it is not just a capital, it is a filter. A place where information, ambition, ideology, media, lobbying, law, philanthropy, and bureaucracy all pass through the same narrow social ecosystem, over and over, until people inside the system can start mistaking their internal conversations for national reality. That is the Washington bubble. Not a conspiracy, not a cartoon, but a psychological condition produced by insulation. Every capital develops some version of a bubble because capitals are coordination hubs. They gather legislators, diplomats, regulators, journalists, judges, think tankers, advocates, consultants, and donors into a concentrated decision-making zone. That concentration is not inherently bad. In some ways, it is necessary. A modern state cannot function if everyone is scattered across 3,000 miles of geography, speaking past one another with no institutional centre. Washington exists precisely so the machinery of a huge republic can be coordinated somewhere. But concentration creates distortion. The more a city revolves around institutions, the more its residents can drift away from the rhythms of the ordinary life elsewhere. Washington is a small place relative to the country it governs, about 702,250 residents in a nation of more than 330 million, and yet it hosts a staggering concentration of people whose jobs involve narrating, regulating, funding, studying, suing, or influencing the rest of America. The district is also unusually wealthy and credentialed, with median household income of $109,870, per capita income of $77,348, and a remarkably educated adult population. That combination produces a city that is brilliant, articulate, and often highly detached from how, Most Americans actually live. That detachment is not always ideological. Sometimes it is simply experiential. Imagine you spend your days around people with graduate degrees, policy frameworks, strong opinions about institutional design, and enough professional fluency to say phrases like democratic backsliding, administrative burden, or stakeholder mapping before lunch. Over time, that environment starts to feel normal. It becomes easy to forget that most people in the country are not spending their mornings reading agency guidance, watching hearings, or debating whether an Inspector General report materially changes the political equilibrium in a mid-level subcommittee fight. That may sound obvious, but psychologically it is easy to lose sight of. Humans calibrate normal based on their immediate environment, and Washington's immediate environment is wildly unrepresentative. This gets even sharper because the city is both elite and fragile at the same time. DC has high incomes and prestigious institutions, but it also has deep inequality, with 17.3% of residents living in poverty. So even inside the district, there are multiple realities running in parallel. The institutionally networked class, the service economy supporting it, long-time residents dealing with housing pressure, and communities navigating a city whose symbolic importance often far exceeds how well it serves all the people living in it. A capital can become insulated from the country, while also being internally divided from itself. That is a psychologically messy combination. And then there is the media effect. Washington is one of the country's densest media political ecosystems. Journalists, spokespeople, campaigns, Hill offices, think tanks, agencies, advocacy groups, and lobbying shops all feed each other information, interpretation, and framing in near real time. That means a relatively small professional class can end up talking in loops. Somebody says something in a hearing, which gets clipped by a reporter, interpreted by an analyst, amplified by an advocacy group, reframed by a consultant, denied by a spokesperson, and then cited the next morning by someone on a panel as evidence of a growing consensus. Sometimes that consensus is real. Sometimes it is 6 buildings talking to each other with excellent posture. You can see why this happens. DC is saturated with institutions devoted to interpretation. Older global think tank indexes found that roughly a quarter of US think tanks were concentrated in Washington, and Georgetown still maintains extensive guides to the city's think tank and NGO ecosystem because the concentration remains so central to how local professional life works. In other words, Washington does not just make policy. It manufactures analysis about policy at industrial scale. That creates a city that is unusually good at explaining America and unusually vulnerable to misunderstanding it. Because explanation is not contact. A person can spend years reading reports about labour markets, rural distress, housing insecurity, migration, religion, manufacturing decline, family structure, regional identity, or populist anger, and still not really know how those realities feel in lived human terms. The bubble emerges when abstraction starts standing in for contact. You no longer need to go see the country because the country has been summarised for you in a deck, a memo, a poll crosstab, a focus group transcript, and a strategically highlighted PDF. The document becomes the world, and Washington loves documents. It loves them with a level of emotional seriousness usually reserved for sacred texts and prenups. Now, to be fair, abstraction is necessary in governance. A national capital must simplify complexity, or it cannot act at all. You cannot govern 50 states and a continental economy through vibes and handwritten letters. Models, briefs, polling, testimony, agency reports, and expert synthesis are essential. But the deeper Washington stays inside representations of reality, the easier it becomes to confuse narrative control with understanding. That is why the city can sometimes look stunned when the country refuses to behave according to the memo. The model was tidy, the electorate was not. This insulation also shows up economically. The district is unusually dependent on the federal state and its surrounding professional ecosystem. As of December 2025, 22.8% of workers in Washington, D.C. were employed by the federal government. That is an extraordinary concentration compared with the nation as a whole. When your city depends that much on one institutional centre, it becomes easier to imagine that centre as the main stage of reality. But most Americans do not live that way. Their jobs, fears, and identities are organised around businesses, schools, churches, hospitals, local governments, logistics, construction, caregiving, retail, factories, and small local institutions, not the federal machine. That difference matters more than Washington likes to admit, because it shapes values. In DC, procedural fluency can look like intelligence. Elsewhere, practical competence may matter more. In DC, institutional legitimacy is emotionally central. Elsewhere, institutions may feel distant, annoying, or actively predatory. In DC, politics feels ambient and immediate. Elsewhere, politics may feel intermittent until it suddenly touches healthcare, wages, fuel prices, farming, schools, taxes, or immigration in very concrete ways. When a city forgets those differences, it starts interpreting the country through its own professional psychology. And that is often where Washington goes wrong. It assumes everyone is watching the same symbolic drama, when many people are mostly trying to make rent, keep a job, raise kids, survive inflation, or navigate healthcare and schooling without losing their minds. The irony is that Washington's own recent instability should make it more humble, not less. The district's job market took major hits in 2025, with federal layoffs driving steep regional employment losses, while office vacancy in downtown DC reached 22.5% by Q4 2025. Those are signs that even the capital's own ecosystem is more brittle than its self-image sometimes suggests. The city likes to imagine itself as the nerve centre of a durable republic. Economically and psychologically, it is also a company town for a very powerful company that keeps reorganising itself. And once you see that, the bubble looks less like arrogance and more like adaptation. People in Washington focus on Washington because Washington determines so much of their fate. Their careers, friendships, status, schedules, and emotional lives are bound up with agencies, elections, offices, and institutions. The city becomes self-referential, partly because it is under constant self-surveillance. That does not make the bubble harmless, it just makes it human. This is why DC often oscillates between confidence and panic. When the bubble feels stable, people inside it can sound weirdly certain that they understand the national mood. When it cracks, after an election shock, a policy backlash, an institutional scandal, a labour market hit, or a public trust collapse, the city suddenly realises it may have been overreading its own conversations. Pew's late 2025 data showed public trust in the federal government remained very low and highly polarised. A capital that sees itself as the guardian of national legitimacy is always going to struggle psychologically when the nation does not return that affection. And that may be the deepest wound in Washington's psyche. The city wants to matter to the country. It does matter to the country. But it also wants to be understood by the country, respected by the country, maybe even loved by the country. That part is much less secure, because for millions of Americans, Washington is not a noble centre of democratic coordination. It is a distant abstraction, a source of taxes, mandates, media noise, scandal, elite preening, partisan theatre, bureaucratic delay, or selective concern. Washington residents may feel they are carrying the burden of governing a difficult nation. Much of the nation experiences Washington as a place that talks too much, costs too much, and listens too selectively. That gap is not just political, it is emotional. So here is the key takeaway from this section. The Washington bubble is what happens when a city built to interpret the nation becomes overexposed to its own institutions and underexposed to ordinary life. It does not mean everyone in DC is clueless. It means the city's incentives push people toward abstraction, self-reference, and mediated contact with reality. The result is a capital that can be incredibly sophisticated and occasionally profoundly out of touch. And once a city becomes insulated like that, one final question remains. What exactly is the lesson of all this? If Washington is a city of proximity power, ambition, controlled language, strategic networking, moral performance, managed anxiety, temperament sorting, and elite insulation, what does that tell us, not just about DC but about power itself? That is where we go next. 9. What Washington, DC really teaches you about power. So after all this, what is the final lesson? What does Washington, D.C. actually reveal? Not just about itself, but about power, institutions, and the people who live too close to both. It reveals something uncomfortable. Power rarely changes human nature. It organizes it. Washington is one of the clearest places in America to watch that happen. Take a city of under 700,000 people. Fill it with institutions that shape a nation of more than 330 million. Layer in high education, high ambition, status competition, expensive housing, public distrust, and unstable career incentives, and you get a place that behaves less like a normal city and more like a psychological lab. The district's estimated population was 693,645 in July 2025. Its median household income remained high at $109,870, yet public trust in the federal government nationally was still near historic lows in late 2025, and DC itself posted the highest unemployment rate in the country in July 2025 at 6.0%. That combination tells you almost everything: prestige, wealth, fragility, and distrust all living in the same zip code. And that is the real psychology of Washington. It is not just a city of power, it is a city of people adapting to power. Some adapt by becoming more disciplined, some by becoming more strategic, some by becoming more polished, some by becoming more anxious, some by becoming more ambitious than they ever planned, some by learning to perform certainty because uncertainty is too expensive, and some, if they are lucky, learn how to stay close to the machine without letting the machine colonize their personality. That is the actual challenge of DC, not merely getting in the room, not merely getting the title, not merely getting near influence. The challenge is staying human in a place that rewards institutional usefulness so aggressively. Because Washington can make you feel important while draining your inner life. It can make you feel informed while distancing you from ordinary reality. It can make you sound moral while quietly training you to speak in incentives. It can make you socially busy and spiritually underfed. It can make anxiety feel like seriousness, proximity feel like purpose, and polished language feel like truth. And this is where we need some nuance, because it would be very easy to end this video by pretending Washington is just a nest of phonies in expensive shoes. That would be lazy. It would also be false. A lot of good people work in Washington. A lot of difficult, necessary, underappreciated work gets done in Washington. A lot of public servants, researchers, legal minds, journalists, reformers, analysts, diplomats, and civic actors are trying, really trying, to hold complicated systems together under brutal incentives. The point is not that Washington is uniquely evil. The point is that Washington makes visible something true about all systems of power. They reward adaptation before they reward purity. That is why DC fascinates people and repels people at the same time. It is a city of intelligence without full peace, conviction without full innocence, service without full selflessness, ambition without full honesty, and sometimes, against the odds, courage in spite of all that. If you are watching this as an outsider, maybe the lesson is this: do not confuse polished language with wisdom. Do not confuse moral branding with virtue. Do not confuse status with substance. And do not assume that people near power necessarily understand life better than people far from it. If you are watching this from inside Washington, then maybe the lesson is harsher. Build a self that your job cannot fully own. Have friendships that are not strategic. Learn to speak plainly sometimes. Touch reality outside the panel, the memo, the office, the hearing, the campaign, the briefing, the donor dinner, the issue summit, the group chat, and the eternal coffee that was definitely supposed to be just 20 minutes. Because if you do not, Washington will do what all capitals eventually try to do. It will turn you into a role, and roles can be useful. Roles can be impressive. Roles can even change history. But roles are not the same as a soul. That, in the end, is the warning of Washington, D.C. It is a city where the symbols are grand, the stakes are real, the people are often brilliant, and the incentives are strong enough to make almost anyone perform a little, bend a little, rationalize a little, and self-edit a little more than they intended. It is not the capital because it contains all of America. It is the capital because it concentrates so many of America's contradictions in one place: idealism and careerism, public service and self-interest, moral language and strategic silence, national importance and personal fragility. And maybe that is why Washington matters psychologically, not because it is uniquely broken, not because it is uniquely corrupt, not because it is uniquely noble, but because it is one of the clearest mirrors we have for what happens when human beings build giant institutions, worship legitimacy, chase relevance, fear exclusion, and still try, sometimes sincerely, sometimes theatrically, sometimes heroically, to call it democracy. If you enjoyed this video, subscribe and stick around because there are more city psychology breakdowns and deep dives coming. And let me know in the comments, which city should we dissect next? Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.